All right, so we are about to start our next talk on track 2, which is the future of esports is the future of GUR, building GUR to meet the challenges of esports user research. And we have Laura, is it Levy or Levy? Sorry, I don't know.
It's Levy, but
Levy,
I've heard
perfect.
a
Laura
variety.
Levy, Ben Medler, and Todd Harris. Any of you please correct me if I'm wrong, and I will let you all take it away.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for attending this panel. It's cool. I think there's about 80 people in the room right now, but it's not possible to see that, I think, as just an attendee in chat. So thanks for coming to our panel, and I am joined by 2 of my favorite colleagues, which are Ben and Todd. Would you 2 like to give your introductions? We'll start with Ben.
Sure, yeah. So I'm a principal data scientist at EA. Worked in a number of different jobs over the years, user research, analytics, fraud. But nowadays I mostly do cross-title, cross-platform analysis and strategy. So yeah, that's what I'm currently up to.
Hey everybody, my name is Todd Harris. Background as a programmer and kind of worked in technology startups for a while. About 15 years ago, part of starting a game developer here in the Atlanta area called High Res Studios. So I come at the games industry wearing the hat of a developer and a publisher. And then just last year, split off a new business focused on esports. So we do esports events and broadcasts like the crowd that's gathered behind me. That was from an event in Atlanta, and been fortunate to work with Laura and her class at Georgia Tech as they've been using some industry data to conduct research.
And my name is Laura Levy. I'm a research scientist at Georgia Tech, and I work as a human factors psychologist. I'm also research director of gaming and esports applied research, which spells GUR, which I tend to mess up every time. And yeah, working with Todd, with a bunch of students, doing lots of different kinds of esports research, which was, well, all of our work was one of the reasons why we wanted to submit this proposal however long ago in the before times. And at the time, we hadn't really seen a lot of talk specifically about esports or games user research in esports, which is definitely happening. And it's really exciting now to see in this virtual summer camp that we actually have an entire esports track, which is super cool. So for a long time, especially in like Western societies in the United States, it's felt like we were kind of approaching this wild west of esports, but I think it's pretty safe to say like we are currently in the midst of it now. And it often feels like no one quite knows what's going to work. So there's all different types of things that are happening. We've seen that even more so now during a pandemic, where we're seeing all kinds of wacky things that people are trying to kind of see what sticks. So we see NASCAR drivers, like professional NASCAR drivers, now driving in game simulations because we can't meet in these spaces and participate in the kinds of traditional live events that we have before. So this means that we are seeing a lot of different kinds of users, and what esports is really morphing and changing quite a lot. There's a diverse set, like more diverse than I've seen in the past, for people who you could consider users in esports. So this includes fans, for example. So Todd, is that from DreamHack Atlanta?
It is.
It is? Okay.
Yep.
So when I was there back in November, it was amazing to see such a diversity of ages. I saw grandparents taking their grandchildren to DreamHack and looking kind of overwhelmed and walking around. And as esports commercializes and becomes more mainstream, it gives us as researchers access to even more sources of data than you could ever imagine, because now we're not confined just to getting data from something like a gaming platform or gaming services. Now we have viewing and streaming platforms, which you can pull data from, or you could consider different kinds of pockets of data. And we have a wide swath of what the gamer is, from a casual to professional gamer and everyone in between. So we're really not just limited to players anymore. And that's one reason why I was excited to get Todd pulled in, is it's fans and viewers and people who might want to get into Overwatch because their city now has a local team, but they have no idea what they're looking at. And we can collect data from many different kinds of sources. So with that set up, I wanted to ask you too, like, what are you excited right now about understanding the user, which is like a very fluid kind of definition from players to fans to viewers. So what are you excited about and understanding about them? And how are you wanting to apply that kind of knowledge or information that you would gather?
Want to start, Ben?
So from our perspective, you know, and I guess in the industry, the biggest thing that we're tackling is this kind of ecosystem of various platforms, services, communication tools, everything that a player uses to stay in touch, to communicate with others, to watch, or to create. And how can we kind of look at that entire ecosystem as an experience in itself? So it's not just doing user research on a product like a game or like a storefront or a website. It's trying to figure out, how does Discord fit into, you know, Twitch, which fits into streaming a game that you could be playing with multiple friends on, versus, you know, watching a tournament, participating in an interactive session with commentators and live stats and stuff like that. So our biggest thing is trying to understand that ecosystem, how our titles and services fits into it, and how can we also partner up with the other, you know, platforms and services within that ecosystem.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. Gaming is obviously about engagement, but these platforms are so open that a fan of one of Ben's games is engaging with that content on so many different platforms and also with different gaming properties. So trying to tease that out, at least from the industry commercial standpoint, is kind of a challenge on what influences what. One specific example of that we looked at recently, being an esports provider, is what is actually the relationship between consuming esports content and playing the game itself. From a traditional sports standpoint, if I watch a lot of college basketball, but I don't play that much basketball anymore. And honestly, the more I watch, I still don't play. That's my personal experience. With games, as publishers, we had this intuition that watching a game supports more playing. But you only have so much disposable time. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe the pie chart of my time spent watching means I'm playing less. So that was one particular research endeavor that we looked at, and specific to a game where we had first party data from high-res studios, the game Smite, and also had linking with Twitch, where within the game industry, a lot of times you'll incent people to link their accounts by giving them an in-game reward. And that allowed us to bridge these two unique islands of data. And if anyone's interested, I can send you the details, but it did end up matching our intuition, where we actually saw that the cohort that watched for a period of time engaged more, meant they played more minutes, they actually spent more money, and they slightly increased their win percentage. So it was a pretty interesting case study, may or may not, of course, apply to a different game or a different community, but matched our intuition and was a pretty good example of the type of thing Ben was talking about around how you tease out these different relationships.
That's so interesting. They actually improved their play performance. What kinds of metrics are you looking at for performance? Is that just like overall wins, or maybe more nuanced even?
In that case, it was wins. This is a commonly debated, item within any match-made team game, whether it's Overwatch or Smite or League of Legends or anything. Is players think they want to be judged on their individual performance, but usually the most effective matchmaking is less based on your kills versus death. And at the end of the day, whether your team won, at the end of the day, those algorithms tend to perform better. And so we did look at kills, deaths, and we did look at gold earned per minute and some other things specific to that particular genre of a MOBA game. But also just in terms of win percentage, we saw an increase.
That's really interesting. And that leads well into one of the questions that I had about one of the clear reasons why you would want to do games user research in esports is to balance the game. But professionals are playing a completely different game than the rest of us, just like in professional sports. Like we will never have a basketball game like, you know, a top tier team. So they're playing a different game. And then, so I watch that and I'm like, yeah, I'm really hyped up. I'm going to go play my own game. I can't really try those strategies. Obviously my skill isn't matching. So how do you use data that you're getting from just across like professional players and casual gamers to know what kinds of decisions to make towards balancing or directing or making changes to a game?
Yeah, so it's a complex problem, which is why you have professional game designers looking at the data, but the data definitely informs what they look at. And at the end of the day, you're slicing and dicing it across those cohorts that you mentioned. So again, whether it's a hero shooter or a MOBA that I can speak in the most depth about, they're team-based. So you are looking at what is the win percentage of a particular character, let's say, and what's the win percentage in the hands of an experienced player at high elo, you know, versus a newer player. You're also looking at what's the win percentage when you know, you're teamed with a friend versus playing with strangers, you know, in ranked versus casual. And so you really have to look at all these different cases, because as a game designer, you're wanting to accommodate all sorts of different play styles. And you know, in many cases you'll see a character that is considered broken at the lower levels of play, but the community self-adjusts, they learn the meta, they can counter it, and at the higher level of play, it might be very underpowered, right, and underrepresented. So it's tricky, but data definitely informs strong game designers to make the right decisions.
Yeah, and I would also say communicating whatever you can back out to the community regarding balance is also pretty key, because they'll see a team use a certain cheese or some sort of strategy in a tournament and then go out and try to do it. They likely don't necessarily always have the skills to pull it off. And then, you know, they get frustrated and, you know, say it's like, you know, underpowered or something's wrong. Or they'll just, you know, all across Reddit, there'll be some debate on, you know, whether or not a character is underpowered or should be buffed or debuffed. But I think it's when the developers get out there and give as much data as they can to actually talk about, like, here are the characters, here are how they perform at different tiers, to try to participate in those debates so that they can at least drive community down a direction that doesn't get to a toxic place. So I think communicating out that data is also very vital to balancing, just so that the players have more info regarding the strategies.
Do you think that's something the industry is currently doing well? You don't have to call
different companies do it well.
Yeah.
I'm not going to necessarily say that my company does it always well. We can always improve. But you know, in different cases, I've seen Riot do it. I've seen Blizzard do it. I think it takes more, you know, a strong community manager. It takes the drive of the team to get out there. And I know developers are always kind of hesitant to get out in front of audiences sometimes. So yes, I think there are good cases out there of people and companies doing that. But again, it can always be improved.
I'm going to, because I'm used to looking at Twitch chat, and I see there was a really good question from Ollie in the chat.
Yeah,
so I'm going to pick up on that, Laura, if it's okay.
Please. Yeah.
And again, specific to what I was talking about before, the research group actually did a really good job of trying to tease out, I can't say they proved causality, but a little more than a correlation, since, again, we would expect that people that watch esports are generally more engaged, and so maybe they they spend more anyway. And so what they did was pretty cool, where they looked at a period of a couple months, and they basically were matching a cohort of users that before the esports season had similar patterns of amount of time played and amount of money spent. So they looked at those two kind of on the back end after the experiment, if you will, and called the control group the group that did not watch during an 8-week period of esports, and then looked at those that did watch and segmented them into infrequent to very frequent watchers. And so that's kind of was their approach to tease out that these groups that had similar patterns before, after the esports treatment, you saw an effect. And in fact, the effect scaled based on how much they watched. And they even looked at what types of players were more apt to see that effect take place. It was the players that had the most variety-seeking behavior, because this was a MOBA game. They were not confined to just a few champions, gods in the case of Smite, which kind of makes sense that they were maybe seeing something that a pro player did, just like Laura was saying, and that gave them, as a variety-seeking player, oh, like, I'm actually going to try out this new character that I was reluctant because I saw them do something, and that drove the engagement. So that was a little bit more on how they tried to separate that. Thanks for the question, Ollie.
Thanks for the explanation. I'm going to apologize in advance for any weird noise. My upstairs neighbor's water heater exploded last night, and they're just now working on it, which is perfect timing. But that was a good way to segue into this other question that I had about, the people attending the SIG and this virtual conference are probably really attracted to the amount of data that we're able to capture from all of these different kinds of sources. But that's also kind of the curse. So we have this glut of data. You can pull it from all kinds of different places. Even in terms of a fan live experience, it's not really new technologies to see where people are in a space and how they're using the space by doing pings off of a cell phone. We have all of this data, but how do we even manage it? Like, what is the state of the industry for approaching this kinds of data? What kinds of data are most important to you methodologically? How do you handle this logistically? Any kind of thoughts around that kind of approach for data analysis and understanding?
For us, we've been doing it for quite a while, so we have kind of the infrastructure to handle that. So we pull in number of different sources at this point. So it does take a lot of infrastructure as well as people to handle a lot of this. It also takes a lot of executive support, at least from a commercial standpoint, of people believing in the data. We're still fighting fights every once in a while with game developers not really seeing the value of communicating and analyzing player behavior. So it's more of having good data stewards, people that understand how data should be connected together, how it should be architected, and then just having good data scientists and analysts that both have domain expertise in the area, know the game or know the platform or space that you're looking into, and just having good methodology for investigating the questions. So we've kind of passed the point of there are big data solutions. Now it's just taking the time to understand the data from the domain that you're looking at, and making sure that you're not making any inferences or creating any causalities that are incorrect.
Yeah, I'd say at high res from a publisher standpoint, and again, I'm more focused on esports these days, but we really did try to culturally get everyone thinking about making data-driven decisions at every position. And it's a smaller company certainly than EA with multiple studios, right? So we're kind of all in one location. But and in terms of the tools, there's actually a company in Atlanta called Answer Rocket, and they try to be Siri for business, if you will. So it's a natural language querying of data sets. So the promise, which of course is not quite there, but it's pretty powerful technology, is that an individual artist, let's say, thinking about the next cosmetic skin they're going to make, can query and understand real time how have previous skins for this particular character, skin's a cosmetic item for sale, so how have previous skins for this character performed, right? Or what about skins of a certain theme, like anime theme versus science fiction? And so that access kind of built into the creation process, whether you're a designer or an artist, is the goal that, you know, I think is helpful. Now, sometimes you can take it too far because there's always this balance between art and marketing, I guess, you know, commerce and just creation. And so that's another fine line, is how do you make sure you're not, you know, squeezing the data so hard that you're removing the soul, right? And the individual just instinct to make something awesome. But I think data, you know, again, just informs talented people to make good decisions. So that's what we try to do. And that's one tool that helps us do that.
Well, with talking about all this data and kinds of data, we would be remiss to not have a discussion on ethics and privacy, which is getting progressively more complicated and convoluted. And a lot of this data that we can pull from different kinds of users, it may be from minors, it may be from the European Union. Now we have COPA, so California has a lot of their own rules for how data and privacy is collected and used. So, and then generally, aside from like EULAs and terms of service, people aren't implicit or explicitly consenting to having their data used in this way. So what are your current thoughts about how the industry is managing this, as particularly in a world of GDPR and COPA?
Want me to go?
Yeah. Do you want to go first, or want me to go first?
So I spent way too long on GDPR. I was actually the player data steward for EA at the time. So I had spent many months working with lawyers on this type of stuff. But honestly, we've always thought that GDPR was helpful. It actually increased the awareness of data and how it should be used and how you should store it, and what you can actually pull from players. So it's allowed us to shore up our architecture, make things a lot more secure than they've ever been. It's allowed us to have more detailed conversations with our partners, how we're sharing data, how we limit the sharing of data. And honestly, like GDPR, especially for larger companies, it was too expensive to only focus on EU like accounts. So we've just made the rules across the entire account system. So at this point, GDPR is kind of the rule of the land for everything. And so we take it pretty seriously in terms of all of the different actions that you can do in terms of, you know, wanting to delete your data or not have it analyzed as part of certain analysis and stuff like that. Even though GDPR wasn't really made for games, I mean, it was mostly made for like banking and finance and, you know, medical records and stuff like that. But I think it's helped out a lot in terms of just increasing our ability to understand what is available and how it should be handled, and also get everybody on board to understand like what personally identifiable information is and how we are using it. So it's always nice when a producer comes to us and says like, oh, we want to capture this data. Is it PII? Like, should we, you know, hash it or something like that? And so it's not just the data folks that are now questioning and looking at and scrutinizing data. It's, you know, the entire pipeline, the entire development team. So
that's impressive.
It's been super helpful. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree on all fronts. It was painful to go through, but just as Ben said, I think even small or medium-sized companies, it's too difficult to have a different process for Europe. So it becomes the law of the land,
Mhm.
kind of that most conservative as of now position is just the default. It is healthy, it makes everyone more aware, including the users, what they're opting into explicitly, which is great for the industry. So yeah, across the board. And then also, as Ben mentioned, I mean, really when it comes to analysis, there's just kind of a clear line between personal identification type data or data in the aggregate. And so for many of these research purposes, the data in the aggregate and anonymized can work very well, and you can have some really cool findings. And so I think it's still a rich treasure trove there because we're dealing with so many users in general, at the top of the funnel, that even if there's ones that opt out or don't explicitly opt in for certain purposes, you still have plenty of records, usually across a very diverse player set, however you want to define that geographically or any other way. And so, yeah, still very rich while being compliant with GDPR and other regulations as they develop, and very healthy for the industry. I think was a good development.
Yeah, we also ran into, there are some problems where, like, so there's a action you can take. You say, I stop processing. Like, you don't want your data to be processed as part of an analysis. Problem is, especially for esports, is when you get into things like matchmaking. Matchmaking is a process of analyzing somebody's historical data. They're usually around their skills, wins, or what have you, and applying that and giving them a rating. And that rating is going to affect their future experience in the game. So when somebody asks to stop processing, does that mean that we just cut off all matchmaking whatsoever for them? Do we put them in some weird limbo of like other players that don't have, ELO ratings or MMRs or something like that? So there's certainly areas that we need to like sort of figure out in terms of like legal precedents and how that's going to work out. So there is that issue of, there's kind of the background. We don't want you to use or if you don't want your data to be used for some processing of like around marketing or other business strategies, but there's also very, real-time decisions that need to be made around the actual player experience that does require data. So there are still issues that we need to solve in that area.
We'll switch gears a little bit. I want to start talking a bit about live events. So Roger Altizer from Utah has this quote that I love, which is that esports is us getting to do traditional sports over again. And if you go to a live esports event, you often see this, where you'll see it's like part music concert, part traditional sporting event where people are kind of sitting around an arena and cheering and booing and all of that. What are the opportunities for growth and lessons learned that we can take from traditional kinds of sports and port that into esports? Like, what are you seeing that's working well? Where do you think we're going with that?
Well, it's obviously a interesting time to ask that question with all live events on hold, so all of us in the esports business, we're now flashing back like 5 to 7 years where it was entirely virtual and there weren't live events and the production is virtual, etc. But looking for when they return, I think that because esports was born online and it's mainly enjoyed from your couch, and your couch is really comfortable, one of the challenge as a live event producer is how do you make it more attractive than the couch, when the couch is a great value proposition. And usually that's leaning into experiential elements and of course community elements. So as you mentioned, the over the top audio visual, bringing in music acts, how do you just create a feel, a vibe that you only get at a live event? And that's big stages and big screens and smoke and halftime acts and really going hard on the experiential side, and then also on the community side for a lot of the events. It's people that have never met in real life, or maybe they meet once a year, at the championship. And so fan meetups, cosplay, other things that only make sense when you're in a physical space, you tend to see a lot of those in the esports arena. So, the silver lining is that while sports is on hold right now, esports is still continuing, but everyone's, of course, very excited to when live events can continue.
Yeah, and then from our side, we can't necessarily do sports over again because most of our games are sports games. So we don't really do them over again. But we tried to augment what's already there. So a lot of the fandom that's already around existing teams, especially in FIFA and Madden and NHL, how do we take that and bring it online and have live tournaments, but then also how do we kind of create the esports experience for those at, I guess, more amateur tiers. So having like weekly tournaments, on the weekend and stuff like that, especially like in FIFA. So yeah, we also see like sports teams themselves getting into and purchasing and building up esports teams. And so it's an interesting time right now where, yes, the NFL seasons kind of been cut, basketball's off, but we see that teams are now getting online, trying to do things virtually. So it's almost like regular sports are trying to understand how to be esports now. So it's interesting to be at a company that has a lot of sports titles that we can just pull from that fandom, from that sports, and then kind of just create a new esports situation around it. But I guess what we're trying to do is augment what's already there, because we already know that there's fandoms for tons of various like football clubs and hockey leagues and stuff like that. So yeah, it's kind of a mix of trying to bring the digital to sports.
So I got to add on to that because we did a really cool event just last Tuesday, the 5th, that involved one of Ben's games, so Madden. So we were working with a bunch of partners to do a digital event that would benefit COVID-19 relief. So it's called COVID, and we trademarked it. And it was actually a 13-hour live stream, all raising money for Boys and Girls Club and AmeriCare. But the highlight content and what kicked it off was when Rob Gronkowski, the day after he announced that he was going to be returning to football at Tampa Bay, he, the next day, issued a challenge in the game Madden, made by EA, against Atlanta hip-hop artist Lil Jon. Quite the mashup. So they issued the challenge over social and started bannering back and forth, and then other people got on board. Then he challenged Ninja in Warzone, and we had that later. And so it was a really cool event, and Lil Jon versus Gronk in Madden, and then later Ninja and Gronk in the game Warzone, and raised a lot of money and was cool. So you're starting to see all these worlds collide between traditional sports athletes who are sitting at home and want to engage their audience, and musicians who are sitting at home and can't perform and want to engage their audience, and games and esports that actually becomes a marketing platform for all of them. So a little bit off the research front, but it was just so cool that I had to bring it up.
I didn't know about that. It's such a weird time that we're living in, but stuff like that is very exciting, again, because these lines are being blurred about like what it is to be in the esports industry, and what esports are. I hadn't been paying attention to the Q&A. I hadn't had that popped out actually. So let me go ahead and field some of these questions. I think one that naturally builds on what we were just talking about by James Trout, and then we'll get to the other ones as well. What do you think the future of user research in esports will be? What is lacking right now that you would love to see more research on?
So I think going back to that whole, we've been trying to do more research on that whole ecosystem piece that we've been talking about, or that I talked about earlier. So doing more ethnographic studies, kind of looking at doing smaller scale studies, but richer in terms of looking at all the pieces that players use throughout their entire process of, not just necessarily for esports, but for playing games in general. It's just gotten so convoluted. So ways that we can kind of look at that as a grand experience, and how we can approach taking user research methodology to that, where you don't necessarily have control over all of the pieces. I think that would be one area that I'd like to see more work in, that we're certainly very interested in.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's a bunch, but at least two. I mean, if you're a game publisher, you know, you want your place to be welcoming, and most multiplayer arenas are not as welcoming as publishers would want. So I think publishers will continue to look at how do they reduce toxicity, you know, increase accessibility and inclusiveness, right? That's going to continue to be a trend for a bunch of different reasons, including just wanting to expand their market share and also make it a friendlier community for everyone, right? And have long lifetime customers. So that's ones that I think publisher will do. And then, as Ben was suggesting, I really think, you know, the super interesting part is fandom, because now games, it's more than a game. It is a lifestyle. There's game properties that are now in the movies, or game properties that people dress up as, game properties that are like sports. And so that nature of fandom is the interesting one. It's also a little challenging, as Ben said, because sometimes these islands of data remain islands. Publishers have that data, and it can be reverse engineered, and they are on the different spectrums from being completely open to completely closed, or somewhere in between. But I think over time, as these full ecosystems develop, you know, whenever there is sharing, there'll be some very interesting insights in that area around really fandom and what helps contribute to that.
That was a great way. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Ben.
Oh, and then I was just thinking, like, we've also, and something that you mentioned earlier, Todd, about, you know, slightly getting better as you watch more esports. We've certainly also been trying to, not necessarily for esports, but just understand how do we train or help players get better at the game over time. And we've done different studies in the past. It's not necessarily all user research per se, but we're certainly interested in how do we use data and build interfaces or tools that help players get better at the game. And I think esports is one driver that could help, where people are very interested in top tier games or top tier play. And then how do we build something in to teach them or to help them increase their skills up through various, you know, ranked modes or something like that. So it's, we've tried different things in the past of like providing instructional videos from various content creators. We've been trying to work on some tools for actually using player gameplay to then build simulations that players could play around with to try to increase their skills. So I think that's another area where esports is probably going to drive, is how do we look at skill and how do we build a kind of a pipeline for competition for increasing skill over time so that more players can participate in sort of, you know, esports tournaments.
Well, that's a good setup for Sam's question. And Sam, I'm wondering if you are in academia, because even though I sit between industry and academia, like I deeply empathize with this question, which is there any kind of central repository of data for academic researchers and/or suggested paths to connect to data owners? So I know that in my own work, this has been a challenge of making the right connections to be able to get access to data. And just like you said, Todd, like a lot of this is very locked down. So to answer, you know, Sam's question, like, is there a central repository of data, and like what kinds of recommendations would you have for doing academic collaborations with industry people?
There's no central repository that I'm aware of. That would be nice, but I don't know that that exists. I think that at at this point, as you know, Laura, it really is reaching out to industry professionals, data owners that you're connected with, whether that's geographically or other. Often geographically is the easiest if there's a game developer or tournament organizer or perhaps an esports team. Any of those entities or a platform, they all have some first party data, and those are now very prominent, throughout most of the US. You could find one of those. So that's probably the recommendation. Certain game developers do have published APIs, application, programming interface for a set of data. They are usually for third-party software providers, to plug in and get access to a small subset. But that does exist for some games, and that is a possible interface to keep things refreshed. Again, you're not going to get access to everything, but it will be more than zero for some number of games, and so that's another area that you could look at. And usually just kind of Googling that, there might be an email box where you request that you want to be a partnered API developer, and you give your use case. And, I think if you're able to provide value to the data holder and they're getting some free analysis, that might be a win-win sort of situation for some of the data holders.
Yeah, as a former academic and having the same exact problem, 10 years ago, I feel bad that I've not been able to try to push more for this, especially at EA. We have worked with various like student universities for like student projects, like giving them access to like subsets of like Madden data or like origin data or something like that for specific like datathons or similar kind of like analysis competitions. And we've certainly worked with certain academics in the past, but it's usually a pretty long vetting process. We don't have IRB, we have legal, and legal tends to be even more conservative when it comes to releasing and making data public. So yeah, usually connections, knowing somebody, making the case that you can, if you had such and such data, you would do this type of analysis and have like a pretty good plan is always important. But unfortunately, not that there may not be a central repository out there, but I don't know of any, at least coming from, I guess, major publishers, unfortunately.
You just gave me an idea, though. So I'm going to say, so now that I'm not a publisher anymore, so Skillshot is a publisher agnostic esports provider. So seriously, we're still pretty early in our data collection efforts, but I am interested in hearing about, potential cooperations there. One of the areas that we do is we power a lot of the collegiate esports activity. So the college space is even more Wild West than the professional space, but there's a group called the National Association of Collegiate Esports. It's 200 universities that have varsity programs where they've actually committed scholarship dollars. So the institution has made an investment. They have an employee who's paid to be a coach, and there's collectively about $16 million of scholarship. So it's a very legitimate enterprise. It's not just kind of kids that might set up a club and then 2 years from now that club doesn't exist. And so we just kicked off powering their competition this year, but I could see that being a nice cohort of competitive data that will have some persistence over time. So again, we're early on, but that may be an opportunity for cooperation for anybody out there over the internet. Just hit me up.
And I recommend it because from my personal experience, I've been working with Todd, both with his role in Hi-Res and then starting Skillshot, of just like networking is super key. So being in academia, just trying to figure out, especially the local connection, which was really helpful with Hi-Res being up in Alpharetta. I could drive up there and go and actually meet people face to face. And then having that ability to say, like, this is what we can do for you that is low risk for you, and we can do collaborative co-design. So you tell us what your problems are and what you could solve if it were anything. We'll come in technology agnostic and make some decisions about what we might be able to build to meet those kinds of challenges. Or it might just be completely exploratory. So to plug Georgia Tech's program real quick, if you are in a university, this might be a format that you might be interested in. It's called a VIP class. So it stands for Vertically Integrated Projects. It's a class that was created at Georgia Tech, and now it's in like 200 universities around the world. They do training, well, they used to at least, like multiple times a week for universities to be able to adapt this model to their own systems. So students apply and on a particular kind of topic. So I have a VIP class that's just about esports. So they apply. I try to take a wide variety of majors, so they're not all computer science majors. I'll have some digital media and some literature and communications people, might have some graphic design. And we work with industry on a project. So with that class, and they take it multiple semesters, basically until they graduate. It's an industry-led class. We meet with partners like Todd or Ben, and we figure out, what are their problems and what might we be able to do with that. And then my job as the professor of that class is to go and bug Hi-Res and Skillshot and Blue Mammoth and Atlanta Rain and like anybody else that is local and say, like, what are your problems? And then figure out what the class might be able to do with that. And sometimes that leads to sponsored research, which for a research scientist like me is great. And other times you just like make really cool things that the students get to put in their portfolios and maybe get jobs from. I actually have had one student from that VIP class that got hired at Hi-Res.
Nice.
So
I remember she interned at
yeah.
DreamHack and then
Yep.
moved over. So that's great.
I'm hoping to turn over the rest like that too.
Good.
So I want to take maybe like the last 5 minutes so the next speaker can get set up. We have one more question that is in our little Q&A box from James. Curious if you have been exploring the new player experience in esports through data, and if so, do you have any examples of decisions made as a result of this data? So new player experience.
Well, I mean, definitely publishers obsess over the new player experience, particularly the games that I'm used to making. They're free to play games, so they're very low friction to install the game, but also very low friction to uninstall the game. So that it's not like you drop $60 and you're kind of maybe gonna, just soldier on, even if, no matter what the first half hour is. So that first experience is critical. I can't say I've looked at any esports specific research, but looking at the in-game experience and exactly what that player journey is, really with the goal being retaining that player, not losing them, and ideally having them make friends in the game and play. And we've looked from a publisher standpoint at what tends to correlate with players who stick around versus not. And again, there's some things around social connection. There's some things around whether they win at the beginning of the game. To tell you how we put that into action back at Hi-Res, the game Paladins, which is a team shooter like Overwatch and others, you play your first few levels against bots. Most people don't even know that. But
I think that's awesome.
and the bots calibrate their difficulty to you. So you're playing with real people on your team, but they're going to get harder or less hard, ideally just enough for you guys to win and have a great experience. So that's a case of, seeing something in the data and then giving that back to game design and product management and shifting the product because of that.
Yeah, in terms of new user, like new to esports, my UR team is probably going to kill me because I don't know I'm sure there's a report somewhere. I just haven't seen it. What I have seen is that we've mostly been using esports for looking at how to modify the competitive aspects of the game as a whole. So like Apex ranked mode from season to season, how that has altered and changed over time, has been looking at different tiers of gameplay, of skill gameplay. And then, yeah, as I was mentioning, like FIFA's weekly tournaments and how like often and what sort of hoops you have to jump through to be participant in that, and kind of all of the modes that revolve around competition are usually somehow affected by what's going on in the esports community, what's going on in competitive gameplay. So I'm not sure about the specific new to esports experience, but certainly from competition or competitive modes in general, it tends to have an effect on them.
Thanks, Becky, for letting us know we can go to the top of the hour. So I'll ask this last question, which I think particularly for the audience of a GUR SIG, it's a virtual summer camp, but it's very industry focused. We have a lot of students that are maybe going through bachelor's and master's and even PhDs with the idea of then going into industry. What do you think that looks like? What is the state of games user research for esports currently? Do you have any advice, or how would someone transition into really focusing on esports if you think that will even be like a defined specific track of user research in the future? What would you recommend to someone wanting to make that kind of transition or jump?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think anything in the data sciences field is great. Every industry needs more analysts, right, that are used to working with big data. I think probably the publishers are the first place I would look at. I mean, that's esports plus games. And again, I love esports, and that's the industry I moved to, but it's kind of like a under $2 billion industry, and games is a $140 billion industry. So the number of jobs right now, esports is built on the foundation of the games industry. So I would start with the publisher first off, if that is interesting to you. And but I also do believe that every esports organization, meaning teams or tournament organizers or platforms like Twitch, once they reach a certain scale of kind of moving out of the basement and being viable, they also will be employing researchers and data scientists, data analysts. So I think you're in a great place if you're here as a student and you want to work in the field. It's gaming is the largest entertainment media. It's growing on every platform. It's COVID proof as much as anything is, and they need more researchers and data scientists. So that's my thought.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, we do have specific analysts, data scientists that focus on esports or competitive gameplay. So yeah, I mean, acquiring the skills of whatever domain that you're in, whether or not you want to do user research specifically, so smaller scale qualitative, or like large scale quant in data science, or somewhere in between, like in the analytics realm. Yeah, you may not necessarily. We don't necessarily hire for specific projects all the time. Usually people can float around and, kind of whatever is their interest at a time. They may move to a certain team, or they move to looking at like our systems or cross-title work. That kind of allows us to flow, or we have the ability to allow people to flow in between these. But we always embed people onto teams. So in esports, and specifically for like Madden and FIFA, we have dedicated people that are working on those teams to highlight any sort of research or analysis that we have around esports. So there are specific roles out there that are focusing on esports, but also just gathering the skills for your particular role is also important too.
I'll push human factors psychology too. So a lot of games user researchers in this group have that kind of background, also known as engineering psych or applied cognitive psych. You can do this research in academia too, so I'll give that little plug. It does, maybe no one's going to hire you with that kind of title. So it requires a lot of just running around and saying like, hey, this is what I do, this is what I do. And then you kind of call yourself that thing, and then you get known on campus or wherever that that's what you do. And you can do that within an academic setting. But I do think that this kind of work has to be led by industry. So it cannot exist in a bubble, which then gets into the challenges of collaboration. But it really does need to be industry led.
I was just going to say, Laura, if you're kind of heading in that user-centered design or UI, UX, or usability analysis, that there's probably all new words, but when I was growing up a long time ago, that's what we called it. But just make sure you also have a passion around games, because again, to work in industry, usually it's that 1-2 punch of having great, functional knowledge, but also having a passion for actually making games. That tends to, people that get jobs in industry tend to have both of those.
Totally agree. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the 49, I think we were up to like 56 or 60 people before that attended this panel. I really appreciate you two giving your time and everybody else coming and visiting. And see you at the rest of the summer camp virtually. Thanks,
Great.
Becky. Thanks,
Everybody.
Jeremiah.
Thank you guys so much.
Thanks
And
for the
thank you so
question.
much to our moderator, Jeremiah, today. He's been fielding questions and
thank
building
you.
an FAQ and directing people around. So it's been great.